Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. According to our guest, Robert Maxim, with the Brookings Institution from Washington, D.C., the COVID-19 pandemic and recession is a crisis that provides policymakers with an opportunity to close the economic gap that exists among regions in our country. His proposal? Invest in economic and community development programs at the nation's key regional public universities that are located in distressed areas. The very first picture in his report is of Fresno State. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Hi, Mark. Thanks so much for having me on.
So listen, let's talk about your report. So what do you see as the overarching problem that you're seeking to address?
The overarching problem that we're trying to solve is that even if the coming recovery resembles the last two, it will likely be spatially uneven, with some places making a quick recovery and others facing continued economic distress. And that distinction between places that will have quick recoveries and those that won't isn't random. We anticipate the places that are already high growth will continue that pattern, and those that have faced years or even decades of economic challenges will fall farther behind. And the reason that that matters is it leaves millions of Americans in these so-called left behind places with minimal prospects for finding well-paying, accessible work, which in turn harms their quality of life.
Yeah, but some people argue, listen, with the advent of the rapid adoption of telework, for example, that's going to equalize the economic gap between regions. Is that true?
You know, that's a narrative we've heard a lot about over the last 18 months, right? The remote work is going to save distressed regions as an influx of workers from high-cost metro areas move to them to get more space and a lower cost of living. In April, however, the New York Times published a piece using U.S. Postal Service data that found that, in effect, places that were already attracting new residents before the pandemic kept doing so, while those that were losing residents kept losing them. And then in June, our team published a piece titled "Remote Work Won't Save the Heartland," in which we note that not only is the share of workers that are telecommuting now declining, but even at its height, the number of teleworkers that were actually moving probably wasn't enough to make a substantive difference for distressed places. And so not only that, but many lower income or economically distressed places have lower rates of broadband access and adoption than economically well-off places. So in effect, the digital divide makes it even more difficult for distressed places to keep up.
That's certainly true here in the Valley. You note in your report that, quote, growing economic divergence is being driven by U.S. migration that is now largely segmented by educational level. So what does it mean for places like the San Joaquin Valley?
Yeah, that's a great question. Research has shown that less educated workers tend to be more place-bound. That is to say, they're less likely to move to a new region or metro area. Now, that's not to say being rooted to a place is bad. Many, I'd even say most, people genuinely live where they want to live, and they value the connection that they have there. When this becomes a problem, though, is when a significant portion of highly educated workers leaves an already economically distressed place, leaving that place with fewer workers and fewer jobs, and a greater share of jobs that are low wage, low productivity, and less upwardly mobile. So for the San Joaquin Valley, which is situated relatively closely to some of the biggest superstar metro areas like San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, and San Diego, there were a lot of options for more highly educated, relatively more mobile workers to depart to.
Yeah, it's interesting. Each Cal State University campus has a primary service area. Of the 23 campuses, Fresno State maintains the greatest share of their graduates within their service area, which is kind of a unique thing. The students don't want to leave the Valley after they graduate, which is kind of interesting. You also have written that education-based sorting not only has economic costs, but also tremendous social costs. Can you explain?
Yeah, and the sorting has effects not just for the places harmed by education-based sorting, but also for places that ostensibly benefit from it. So in places harmed, the relative lack of good paying, accessible jobs hurts individuals' quality of life, both materially, but also in terms of personal fulfillment and mental health. There's a lot of evidence showing that that happens. It also means less local tax revenue, which degrades the quality of government services. And then on the other hand, you're seeing negative effects for people in well-off superstar metro areas as well. Skyrocketing housing prices, overburdened infrastructure, record traffic and commute times, and growing local inequality are all issues that are exacerbated by these trends.
Yeah, you're certainly seeing that in California. So what's your proposal?
Our proposal is to provide federal grants of between $25 and $50 million paid over 5 years to regional public universities in distressed communities. These grants would be specifically aimed at supporting these schools' economic and community development missions. And so we think doing so will provide new resources for critical neighborhood anchor institutions and help close the funding gaps that exist between regional public universities and larger public research universities. So we identify at least 140 universities in the US that could potentially be eligible, including Fresno State. But we actually think Congress should go bold in what is becoming a pretty critical moment for fragile recovery and consider making as many institutions as possible eligible for this program.
Okay, well, up next, we're going to talk about regional public universities like Fresno State and what impact they can have on the economy locally, particularly near distressed communities. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. The economic well-being of the Valley residents has consistently lagged behind state and national averages. In fact, 1 in 5 Valley residents continues to live in poverty, and that's been true for literally generations. According to our guest, Robert Maxim, however, the federal government can and should play a role, particularly through regional public universities, in changing that narrative. So I want to ask you a question about how you distinguish between regional public universities like California State University campuses at Fresno, et cetera, versus research institutions at University of California. Can you explain the difference?
Yeah, sure thing. And so, before I dive in, I should just note that California is one of the states that has perhaps the most exemplary distinction between these two classes of universities. The California Master Plan really laid out distinct roles for each of these schools. So R1s are known for basic research as well as technology transfer and commercialization. That's really developing products from the school's research that they do. Regional public universities conduct research too, but in general, it tends to be more applied research with an emphasis on local or regional needs. And, on top of that, evidence suggests that regional public universities can promote small business incubation for communities as well. We also find regional public universities tend to be more accessible and affordable. They provide access to groups who are traditionally underserved and so can therefore be important sources of upward mobility. So we think that these distinct missions mean that while federal policymakers have a vested interest in providing greater support for regional public universities, they should do so in a way that preserves their community-focused role and student access mission.
Yeah, you note in your report that it's not like these regional public universities don't get money. I mean, they do get some federal support, but the vast majority of federal support for universities goes to these R1s, these research institutions, meaning that these RPUs, regional public universities, and those communities are kind of left behind in the equation. Can you provide some examples?
Yeah, so regional or R1s, big research universities, get robust federal funding through what's called indirect costs. So this is the portion of federal research money that goes to cover general university overhead. It can sometimes be as much as 25 to over a third of the entire federal grant. As an example, take Wayne State University in Michigan. It is a R1 research university in a distressed community, and then take the University of Michigan Flint, which is a regional public university in a distressed community in the same state. Because of this research funding, roughly 1,000 times as much funding goes to Wayne State and flows through to the broader Detroit community than is received by University of Michigan Flint and flowing into the Flint community. So you see that level of inequality, not only in communities, but in the federal supports that Congress and the federal government are providing to different distressed communities, depending on what class of institution they have in them.
Yeah, I mean, the point you're making about indirect costs is really significant. That's, a huge 25% of the overall grant is just, frankly, to help the university operate. So that's a great source of funding for these big R1 research institutions that regional public universities like Fresno State really aren't accessing. Let's talk a little bit about how you'd make this proposal a reality. First, you got to define, what is a quote unquote regional public university, that serves a quote unquote distressed community. So which universities will qualify under your current proposal?
And before I actually dive in here, I think it's important to note too that there's no one definition of distress, and there's no one definition of a region. And so we propose one idea. We actually think, as I mentioned in the previous segment, Congress should go broad here. So what we say is that schools should be made eligible based on the median family income in the community that they serve relative to either the state or the nation, depending on if they're a high-cost state like California or a low-cost state like somewhere like Georgia and Louisiana. And if they are eligible based on that, we think that they should be able to receive planning grants for several $100,000 to design interventions to support the local community and support economic and community development within that. From there, we propose schools being eligible for implementation grants of between $25 and $50 million over 5 years. And so this, grant money can be used for a variety of different projects, whether it's physical redevelopment, up to digital infrastructure, community-focused research, or other forms of economic and community development. But one thing I'd just note quickly is, Congress and the EDA has already defined distress in some ways. We encourage them to, use their pre-existing definitions, and in particular, think about regional distress, not just where the school is situated, but the students and communities that those schools are serving.
We've only got about 30 seconds left in this segment, but I want to ask you this question. I mean, we talk a lot about distressed communities, and you've defined in this report it really local, what's adjacent to the campus. Like, so Fresno State is adjacent to a poor community, so it fits. But a school like, say, Stanislaus State or CSU Bakersfield are in newer, nicer areas, frankly, and so they wouldn't qualify. Is your concern that the broader you make that definition of distressed community, the less immediate economic impact that regional public university is going to have?
I think that might be a concern, but one thing that you could do to, for example, mitigate that is think about where students enroll from in that university. And I think if you take a school like Bakersfield or Stanislaus, you'd see that there's really enrollment from a set geography, and that also overlaps with the geography that school is serving.
Okay, so up next, we're going to talk about some of the programs and projects that might be funded. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Robert Maxim with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. about a recent report he co-authored about how the federal government can support economic and community development efforts by regional public universities like Fresno State. You write in your report that, quote, Congress should leverage a formula grant program with safeguards to ensure that federal funding supplements rather than supplants state funding. Exactly how would that work?
That's a great question. So there are a variety of actually existing federal formula grants that could serve as a precedent, in particular those that are used in the Higher Education Act of 1965 to support minority-serving institutions and schools that serve low-income communities. So the way that we design ours is, first, the federal government would automatically designate schools as a distressed community-serving institution if they're located in a distressed community. Those schools would be notified and given the option to accept a planning grant, which would be a $100,000 or more grant that provides support for a year or two to help those schools put together a regional plan for supporting the community that they're situated in. And so what that would incorporate is not just the role of the school, but private industry, nonprofit actors, philanthropy, and other community actors that really support that community. Once that plan's approved, and we think that either the Department of Education or the Economic Development Administration would be really good federal agencies to administer this. Universities would be eligible to receive implementation grants of between $25 and $50 million over 5 years to actually make those investments and begin supporting their community.
So I'm going to be very practical here. I mean, one of the concerns that people are worrying about is this going to be a method where, you rob Peter to pay Paul? So you give federal funding, and the state says, oh, regional public university got federal funding, so we can now take back state funding. It ends up with a net zero. How do you make sure that doesn't happen?
It's actually a very real concern, and it's something that states have done in the past. And so one way around that is to ensure that implementation grants have what are called maintenance of effort requirements. So in effect, a state would be required to maintain their higher education appropriations at a certain level relative to a baseline year in order to prevent this funding from supplanting state funding. This exists already in things like the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act. It's quite commonly used by Congress, and we think this is a perfect instance to use them.
Yeah, if people have been there, done that, right? They've seen this happen before, so they're going to set up a system so it doesn't happen again. Can you give me an idea of the kinds of programs or projects that might be funded or eligible for this kind of program?
Yeah, I mentioned a couple earlier: physical redevelopment, investment in digital infrastructure. Another one that I mentioned is entrepreneurship and business development services, in particular with a focus on underrepresented groups. We really think that, especially in the wake of what has been a really churned recovery and recession because of the pandemic, the need to create new firms and jobs is hugely important. So, providing that type of startup capital with, in particular, focus on underrepresented groups is hugely important. One school that's done that in the past is Penn State Barron in Northwest Pennsylvania. They have an innovation beehive network. We think that's a great example of that type of work. Another one is thinking about connecting these regions and actually bridging the digital divide. One school that does so is Northern Michigan University. They have a high-speed internet access that connects the entirety of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. These are the type of projects that can really help communities when they're thinking about their long-term.
I read that in your report about Michigan, because we actually had convened a group of regional public universities, Stanislaus State, State, and Bakersfield, about how we might be able to help close the digital divide. And we looked specifically at Michigan and their proposal. And one of the things that we have, internet service here on the campus, that there's no reason why we can't expand that to local communities. So that's one of the things that we're looking at in terms of closing the digital divide. So that was really interesting to see that in your report. Listen, finally, I want to ask you a question about establishing a department. You're talking about the Department of Distressed Community Universities, either in the Department of Ed or in the Econ Development Administration. What would be their charge? What would they do?
Yeah, they would really do two things in my mind. The first is not only would they distribute those grants, but they would be charged with making those grants as equitable as possible to places and to communities within those places. And then on top of that, we think they should serve as a center for best practices, convening communities, preserving what has worked, noting what hasn't, and really serving as a place that, communities can go to as they're thinking about their long-term strategic planning.
Okay, well, up next, we're going to talk about the fiscal and economic implications of a federal investment in California State University campuses like Fresno State. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. It's been said that the future of California, and indeed the nation, goes through economically distressed areas like the San Joaquin Valley. State universities like Fresno State have the talent and expertise to potentially offer and implement creative and impactful solutions. But state universities traditionally have barely enough money to deal with their core mission of teaching, much less add a new mission of economic and community development. So the question is, how can we improve the economic vitality of regions through these RPUs? Our guest, Robert Maxim with the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., has some ideas on this issue. So one thing I want to mention to you is about your report. You talk about something called the multiplier effect. Can you explain?
Yeah, and so what that means is, the positive economic impacts that come from a project can serve as a base to further build around. So we use estimates from a group called the Economic Policy Institute, and it provides us some insight into the potential employment impacts that a project can have. So, for example, if you build a building, that building is going to require inputs from not only construction workers, but from suppliers, all the way, upstream, lumber to glass to, steel. All of those pieces of demand are going to create new jobs. And then once that building is up, it's going to be filled with workers or students who are then going to spend money elsewhere. So they may want to go get lunch or get haircuts. So we're measuring not just the number of direct jobs created, but also the number of indirect jobs, those suppliers, and the number of induced jobs, those people getting haircuts or buying lunch, that each project would create.
You also note in your report, it doesn't include these downstream effects that these investments can have. Can you give some examples?
Yeah, and so the EPI numbers are great, but they do base their estimates on a fixed investment amount. So what they don't consider, for example, is if a school puts in a massive new broadband investment, that is going to have really important effects around internet connectivity. It'll allow more workers to work there, work remotely. It will create new manufacturing or service opportunities. It will connect students to better skill development opportunities, which will help them down the line. So all of these types of downstream investments are really tough to model, and so they tend to not get included as a result. Another example is investment in business development, creating new jobs, creating new firms that can spin out. It's really difficult to precisely measure those effects. And so in some ways, our estimates actually underestimate the amount of economic impact that these types of investments can have.
It's just interesting. We in the Valley, we have some issues in surrounding issues like healthcare. And, when we talk about the digital divide, you think about maybe that could help close that gap when it comes to healthcare. We've got major achievement gaps in education. Again, broadband, very important. I do see that as kind of a cutting edge going forward. If we can deal with broadband and make it more accessible to folks, it really can help the region economically, socially, educationally, health-wise, et cetera. Let me ask you this. You suggest the best way to determine your return on investment is to, quote, to track the fiscal impacts of these grants and estimate that based on the income tax collections that would come from jobs that these grants create. So how would you go about figuring out the return on investment of a federal investment in economic and community development programs, let's say would be established at a school like Fresno State?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one way to think about this program is it's not just a federal investment into the community, but it is in some ways a federal transfer from the federal government in Washington to local and state governments as well. So for example, given the assumptions around federal and state income taxes that workers would pay on the jobs created by these projects, the direct, the indirect, and the induced jobs, we estimate that a $50 million investment could generate anywhere from $3 to $12 million in federal income tax collections and anywhere from $1 to $5 million in state income tax collections. Local income tax, a little bit more difficult to measure because it's mostly relying on property tax, but if property values go up, that'll help localities as well. We think that any revenue impacts could be higher over time as downstream jobs and businesses, really grow into having a positive economic effect.
And that's each year, right? Each year that can produce that kind of tax revenue. Let me ask you this: after what you've studied this, what do you and your co-author conclude?
I think that our biggest takeaway is, we truly believe that a concerted federal effort to support, regional public universities and the distressed communities that they serve can both stem some of the higher education disinvestment and inequality that the nation has seen over the past decade, while also promoting a more racially and spatially inclusive recovery. And again, this is a really critical time for that recovery, and we think this is the type of investment.
It's a very interesting report, and I hope folks read it online. I want to thank our guest, Robert Maxim, with the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thank you for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.